Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Bonjour à tous. It's my pleasure to be here today at the conference with a distinguished panel to unpack what I think is one of the most complex and nuanced and also urgent topics in urbanism these days, smart cities, digitalization. What exactly do we mean by that? And where can digital tech serve to to serve the goals of civic government. It will be the focus of our discussion today. So to begin with, I'd just like each of our panelists to introduce themselves. And each of you, if you could, as you introduce yourselves and your work, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about where you think digital tech could serve civic government. Where do you see the use cases? Where do you see the potential? Greg.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll just quickly go. I'm currently an urban tech fellow at Cornell Tech, but I work with a number of affiliations and a number of projects. So here's like four that I can think of off the top of my head. At Cornell Tech, I run a project called the Metaverse Metropolis, which started with the notion of looking at augmented reality and other forms of spatial computing, as Apple now calls it, and helping cities to think about what happens when Google and Apple and other tech companies start to come to actually overlay information on public space. And for cities, we will discuss AI obviously as well, but it's this larger question of having for the last decade watched disruptive companies like Uber, Airbnb, and others come in and sort of cause all these externalities in cities. How can cities build the capacity to think about how they're going to understand, manage, and regulate new technologies? How do you build a framework to evaluate what has potential? So that's one. Another, I've worked with actually Benji de Peña for the UN Development Program last year on thinking about the digitalization of informal transport in the Global South. So looking at companies like Gojek and Grab and Ola across the Global South about how these super apps are welding together various services there and what lessons that holds for governments. I've also worked on a project called Climate Alpha, which is a startup that is basically combining climate modeling with demographic and economic data. So we're advising governments and private companies about basically where to move and where to build in a world of climate change, which we can discuss as well, thinking about site selection. And then my fourth at MIT, where I'm a senior fellow, we are actually looking at sort of how digitalization can help communities connect together at the Future Urban Collectives Lab. So in that role, I've looked at how pandemic-era mutual aid groups that use text messages and other forms of messaging and connections to help each other, how can we grow those communities and build into more robust? So lots to discuss there.
Indeed. Thank you. Jackie.
Hi, it's so great to be here. Thank you. I am a recovering public servant, having spent 20 years in the New York City Parks Department, working on various digitalization initiatives, starting with the 311 system under the Bloomberg administration. Currently, I work at Helpful Places, or it's my company, so it's a mission-driven startup, and we focus on enabling organizations and communities to deploy technologies in a way that invite feedback and participation from the public through the deployment of an open source communication standard called Digital Trust for Places and Routines that has now been deployed across France, Australia, and North America. You can think of it as a wayfinding system for urban technology. We recognize that when we talk about digitalization in urban management, that is a tongue twister, that internally in the public service, you see that as a change management process. You are changing the way processes and systems currently work and how decisions are made. And I think in this era of embedded technologies and AI, as well as augmented reality layers, my question for all of you is how do we bring the public along and make sure that they are part of that change management process? Because I believe the potential for smart cities and urban technology is actually to increase equity in the way we deliver services. So I worked a long time in the New York City Parks Department, which is a heavily complaint-driven system.
And when you said complaint-driven?
Complaint-driven. So if you think about how with the rollout of 311 customer service systems, we're systematizing the way complaints are brought in, the potential for use of embedded technologies and ubiquitous sensing like sensors is to actually have the environment talk to you and let you know what the needs are in the community. So I think that is really, when we think about the potential of technology in urban management, that is the holy grail. So.
Excellent. Thank you. François.
Yes, François William Croteau. Je suis actuellement directeur général de l'Institut de la résilience urbaine, sur lequel, donc, institut que j'ai créé pour accompagner les villes en gouvernance de la transition écologique. On les accompagne sur plusieurs sujets, entre autres toute la gouvernance des données et l'utilisation naturellement des modes de gestion différents pour créer l'innovation sur les territoires. Parallèlement, je suis également chercheur et professeur associé à l'UQAM où on travaille actuellement sur un projet d'Observatoire national sur la gouvernance des données pour les municipalités et les territoires au Québec, ce qui est un élément important. Travail que nous réalisons avec le pôle sur la ville résiliente pour aider les villes éventuellement à développer une culture de prise de décision par la donnée, qui est un élément important dont on va parler aussi aujourd'hui. Et c'est ça sur quoi on travaille beaucoup actuellement à l'UQAM. Également, je suis chroniqueur au journal Le Devoir. D'ailleurs, j'ai écrit une chronique aujourd'hui sur le techno-optimisme ou pas qu'on doit avoir au sein de nos territoires. Et c'est un élément sur lequel j'ai eu la chance de travailler comme responsable au comité exécutif de la Ville de Montréal pendant 4 ans, entre autres, comme responsable de la Ville intelligente et des technologies de l'information, où j'ai eu à piloter la première stratégie numérique de la Ville de Montréal, aussi toute la question de la transformation numérique et l'usage éthique et responsable des données, de l'intelligence artificielle et de l'Internet des objets, qui est un élément important pour les villes en termes de transformation urbaine. Encore faut-il que les villes aient avec eux les outils pour faire face à ce flot de technologies. Et puis, voilà.
Ça suffit, merci. Est-ce que nous sommes des techno-optimistes ici? On va voir. Benji, please, can you tell us about your work in your organization?
Thank you so much. I'm Benjamin Benji de la Peña. I am the CEO of the Shared Use Mobility Center that's based in Chicago and LA. I also wear another hat. I'm the chair of the Global Partnership. I'm sorry, we changed our name. The Global Network for Popular Transportation, which Greg had talked about, and it's about informal transportation systems. If you've traveled in the Global South, these are matatus, auto rickshaws. And so I am a transportation and urban geek. I was the chief of strategy and innovation at the Seattle Department of Transportation. And like Jackie, I'm a recovering public servant, although that was just a 4-year service. But if you ask me, what can we focus on? A lot of the digitization conversation has been very much about the interface between public and government, and very much of that conversation is customer framed. And we need more people who are more qualified than me will talk about. We really need to engage citizens and residents, right? Be careful of the word citizen, Indeed. So that there is participation in governance and not just, like Jackie was saying, complaints-driven, how do we deliver this better? That said, I ran lean transformation programs in the Seattle Department of Transportation, so there is so much that digitization, rightly framed and goal and values-driven, could save in terms of process. Because within departments itself, these processes, which are long and arc through so many requirements, take forever, and no one owns those processes. And so that's one area. The other, of course, as being a transportation person, is how do we use digital technologies to free people from having to own and spend on and run their own private car, which is not sustainable, damaging to the climate. Even if you move to electric cars, we need to electrify, but that's not enough. How do we make the city way more convenient and give people the right to the city so they can access community and opportunity without having to invest $30,000, $40,000 in owning a car or spending $10,000 US dollars a year on it?
Right, and so that's car sharing is one of, or information that facilitates car sharing is one of several categories of information that you mentioned. Before we move on, you mentioned processes, and I think this will be important for our conversation. Can you just give a very brief example of what kind of process we would be thinking about? Like what would government be attempting to do that would be served by digital tech?
Two examples, both from Seattle. We looked at the process for approving construction work. So construction goes from 0 to 30% design, and then you go to 30 to 90% before you go out to bid and then farm it out. In Seattle, which had passed a tax to bring more resources to building transportation, it was taking 18 months to get from 0 to 30% design. And so we did a lean transformation process to say, who owns the parts of this process and where does it go to? And with the team that was doing that, realized they could shorten the process to 6 months. And this is without digitization, right? It was just really painfully mapping out. It would take a week to just map out a process. And that's just within a single unit in the department. So figuring out, for instance, a permit to where to dig and when can you dig, you would need to go to the Department of Transportation, sewers, power utilities. If you could take that kind of process mapping and figure out where you can shorten it, then it would get a lot of efficiency gains. The other is simply permitting of where you can dig. It's a scheduling process, right? And so what you need to do is look at a schedule and see what's going on that time, who has permits, how long will it go, where will I reroute everyone? And that's painstaking. And that's basically because the scheduling systems are built on GIS rather than time. And so figuring out how to do that with better understanding of the process could get us savings, in real savings. I think the processes we put in was saving something in the order of $1 million a year just on process cuts.
Interesting. I think inefficient road construction is a topic that may resonate here in Montreal. But
It's a not trivial matter to figure out what's happening where.
Indeed. Yeah, and I think to your point, understanding having a fine understanding of complex sets of data and understanding how to manage them, even on subjects like road construction and utility construction, which might not seem sexy, might actually prove to be a valuable sort of domain for civic tech. Agreed? Can anyone else want to speak to that general idea?
Well, I would love to sort of speak about sort of process improvement because that's so much of what I focused on, especially in New York City government. And I think what I take away from what you're saying is that it's actually not the tech. It is all about the people. It is all about the organization and the processes. And so when I ran data innovation in New York City government, we actually very deliberately shied away from any kind of platform. We started with sending data scientists out into the field, not an easy task, by the way. And then also looking at mapping those existing business processes and identifying the decision points in that process and looking very specifically at where improved information could improve the decision. Because it was actually, I think one of the challenges when we talk about these incredibly complex legacy systems, trying to untangle and sort of shift that process is just like a massive change management initiative that can take years. And so I think a more lightweight way to try to accelerate the benefits of technology adoption in cities is to look very specifically at where it can cut into a process, and a key piece of insight or an improvement of data can sort of improve the decision or the process in place without trying to shift the whole organization. Because that's how you get $400 million system boondoggles.
I'm going to jump in. I totally agree. Yeah. And it's also paying attention to the information flows.
Yeah.
Right. And part of that is, so we had a traffic operation center, bought a system from Siemens that generated the reports that the TOC center needed, but needed to be translated into a database or CSV or Excel charts. Someone had to manually do that because the system was producing it in PDF. So understanding that process flow, again, it's like what you're saying. First, we need to do, what are we trying to do? What are the values that guide it? Then you figure out what the technology tools are.
François, do you want to speak to that? How are you using data in your work now to address the climate crisis? And what kinds of data are you working with?
Je vais rebondir sur ce qu'on vient aussi de parler, sur l'élément d'identifier les besoins, les processus, parce que c'est un élément fondamental. On peut arriver avec une technologie toute prête et proposer une ville, par exemple, prenons l'émission des permis de construction dans une ville comme Montréal qui vit encore un boom immobilier, et on peut parler de complexité d'obtention de permis, on parle souvent de ces éléments-là, et on peut se dire, mais comment ça, c'est pas numérisé? Pourquoi on n'a pas plus d'informations, de données, de simplification des processus? La numérisation, peut-être même l'utilisation de l'intelligence artificielle pourrait accélérer ou faciliter la délivrance des permis. Mais avant d'arriver à ce processus-là, il faut avant tout se poser la question sur quels sont les processus en place actuellement qui existent, comment les simplifier, comment inscrire ou, je veux dire, traduire ces processus-là en processus numérique, informatique. Ensuite, quel est le besoin des citoyens et des entrepreneurs? C'est quoi exactement les besoins qu'ils ont? Est-ce que ce sont des besoins uniquement numériques, de transactions numériques ou non? Finalement, les employés, il faut être certain que pour eux, ça va être une simplification de leur travail parce que si on arrive avec une technologie, l'intégration d'une nouvelle technologie ou d'utilisation d'outils numériques, si pour les employés, c'est vu comme une tâche supplémentaire, un fardeau à leur quotidien, vous n'aurez pas l'adhésion de l'organisation. Vous allez beau avoir à pousser cette technologie-là, il n'y aura pas de transformation de la culture organisationnelle et vous foncez dans un mur. Donc, c'est un élément qui est fondamental avant d'arriver avec une solution. Sauf qu'un autre élément aussi qui est important, encore faut-il que la ville ait déjà une base fondamentale technologique. Si une ville émet ses permis, par exemple, encore à la main, on part de très, très loin. Donc, avant d'arriver à une solution aussi avancée, il y a beaucoup de constructions et d'étapes à accomplir avant d'arriver à une numérisation et d'utiliser l'intelligence artificielle pour planifier le territoire. On peut rêver à se doter d'algorithmes qui vont nous permettre d'identifier les besoins territoriaux et de mieux prévoir le développement urbain en se disant dans ce secteur-ci, voici les défis climatiques, sociaux, économiques, comment on peut adapter les projets immobiliers en se dotant d'objectifs à atteindre dans ces projets-là. Mais avant d'arriver à ces objectifs, encore faut-il se doter de la base fondamentale, donc c'est-à-dire d'une structure de gestion des données, une structure organisationnelle où on va avoir des logiciels qui vont même se parler entre eux, ce qui est souvent pas le cas dans les organisations, d'intégrer les processus, simplifier les processus et s'assurer qu'on respecte les lois et règlements et par la suite, on pourrait y arriver. Et donc, c'est un processus qui peut être long, mais on a tendance parfois à sauter des étapes, à se doter de solutions miraculeuses. Puis une fois qu'on les intègre dans une organisation, bien, on fait face à un mur, puis c'est inopérationnel, puis on le voit, on peut le voir souvent, on l'a vécu récemment avec le nouveau système de la SAC, ou on l'a vu à Ottawa avec le système Phoenix. Lorsqu'on y va en intégrant une solution technologique plutôt que de répondre à un besoin opérationnel et un besoin de nos citoyens et des employés, à chaque fois, on commet une erreur qui coûte des millions de dollars aux organisations.
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, so to summarize, in order for government to use tech, the organizational structure needs to be straightened out. The place of data and as well the presence of data needs to be cleared up. And I think this is a crucial point that you made, that it needs to respond to an ask or a need of civic government. So Greg, you haven't spoken. I'll give you a turn. It's been a minute. Do you see opportunities or instances in which civic tech is responding to specific needs of civic government, where technologies are successfully, not imposing a solution, but responding to a real need?
Yeah, I mean, this is like the rub of this. When you mentioned smart cities, like my skin crawled a little bit there in terms of like that whole phrase of how that went wrong. I mean, so I'm not a recovering public servant. I'm a recovering journalist, sort of now in the foresight business. So working with organizations to sort of see what's coming next versus simply responding to the latest reaction. And of course, the whole problem with smart cities is or the sort of data collection and building models is responding to what has always happened there, and also based on the sort of positivist notion of like what can be done. So I'll give you an interesting example, which I think is sort of the perversities of this, and actually Jackie's involved with this too. Jackie's worked with a startup that's sort of part of my cohort at Cornell Tech called In Situ. They are augmented reality. They use your phones. You can use Snap or some other apps. But what they've done is they've taken the database of the Department of Buildings in New York, and now they have a partnership with Washington, D.C., to show you literally the building volumes of all the planned and forthcoming projects. And the idea behind it is, which I think is a very noble one, is the idea if you show local residents what is coming in their own phones, they will be less resistant to change. How do you get past that NIMBY impulse to fight every project that we will stop? But the interesting thing that I have seen on various tours with them and various community groups is that you are in fact alerting the local NIMBYs that something is coming. And in fact, you are helping to inadvertently galvanize the reaction to it. And to me, it's a question of, in deploying all these technologies, are we basing it on assumptions? This positive notion of if you present data and we make data-driven arguments, people respond to it. So I think that's a little problematic. And then the other function I am is like, is the notion of like, how do you basically source those local use cases, or how do you put these tools into the hands of people, whether that is, figuring out what uses of smartphones will be, or in the case of like AR, like how do you allow local communities to annotate their own neighborhoods versus having things imposed like that from Google. So I know that's the sort of thing we're exploring next month in our workshop. We're going to basically do sort of a futures exercise to like basically lay out all these potential scenarios and do these kinds of findings of like, what is it? Like what uses of the tech will actually follow your public policy outcomes, your goals that you want, versus like, oh, I have this technology, what do I do with it? What they call solutionism of like which I think crypto has been the worst version of that one over the last however many years. I have this blockchain. What can I do with this blockchain? I think we've got to get out of that mindset of like, here's the latest shiny technology where if I use it, it makes me look like an innovator and a thought leader and a progressive public servant versus like what will actually achieve my public policy outcomes. So.
And you sort of implied that this was one of sort of the central flaw in the smart cities movement 15 years ago, right? When it began, that the technology presented itself as a solution to any and all problems, whether or not they were real.
Well, totally, and two veins in that one. If you go back 15 years when IBM introduced this idea, IBM, Cisco, like all the companies then, I mean, you go to Expo 2010 in China and it was heroic city planners with holograms of the city, very much top-down control. They built that. That is, I mean, not to get too controversial here, but that is the Chinese surveillance state that they have constructed with the help of those Western companies, Cisco and others. So, we have that, there's that model of the smart city, and I don't think any of us would want to subscribe to it. So I think about that. And then, that's sort of the thing is like, how do you avoid that sort of top-down imposition? And one thing that I'll say to that is that, again, the disruptions posed by Uber and other companies were a real shock to the system for public officials as they figure that out. And members of my cohort thinking about the metaverse are also members who, in one case, in the case of Los Angeles, wrote their own software, commissioned their own software standards to regulate new forms of mobility, and were accused in lawsuits by the Uber, American Civil Liberties Union, and the Electronic Frontier Foundation of basically fighting fire with fire, that the cure was worse than the disease in terms of government having granular data collection on the exact movements of people. And I literally watched this yesterday with my cohort. We had Chris Gilliard, who is a noted critic of racialized surveillance, and I watched these public officials grapple with this idea of like, what if we're the bad guys? What if there's no good uses of this kind of technology, even though they saw themselves as responding to the threats posed by private companies, preying on the public realm? It was really interesting, that tension there about like, how do you do good from the top down? Is that even possible when it comes to deploying this tech?
If I may jump in, I think, again, my skin crawls towards smart cities, right? We've been in it for a long time. The problem is that we think of technological solutions as objective, and so therefore fair. Yeah. And it layers upon the reality of a social-political system. Yeah. And we imagine that this fairness, first of all, it's abstracted, right? So you choose what do you pay attention to and what data can you collect, right, which already abstracts that data. And Jackie has that experience of, it's all the complaints in Midtown Manhattan about trash. So you imagine the rest of the boroughs don't have any trash problems, but they don't have complaints because it's largely people of color or immigrants who are hesitant to call, right? But so it layers on to this socio-political system that has powerful interests. And what we need to admit is the shifting of information and who controls it is a shift in power. And so part of what we have to understand is who has the power now and who are you shifting power to? One of my favorite examples and whipping boy is the World Bank's e-Boomi program in Karnataka, India. It's 2 decades now. I keep mentioning it. But basically, it was very well-intentioned. It's still running. It was, let's digitize all the cadastral data of farmlands across the state of Karnataka.
Land holdings data.
Land holdings, like your farms, whatever. And you put it in a GIS system, so therefore we're very clear where the boundaries are. We've got insights on who's going to buy what, and it'll clean up corruption. It cleaned up corruption a bit. But what happened was, although the data was open to everyone, smallholder farmers didn't have big analytical tools that they could then figure out what was being sold. Who had those tools? Real estate brokers in New Jersey, who could then assemble large pieces of land to sell to IT companies and assemble it around Bangalore. So there's a shifting of power that happens. And so as we think about these technologies, we have to seriously ask, who has the power now? Will that harden that power or will it shift it? And what are you doing to make it more equitable?
Jackie?
And I think this is where we sort of go back to the focus on like, what does that change management process look like in a way that's inclusive, that allows all of these different voices to be surfaced? Because I think it is really problematic. Some of actually I work with a nonprofit that is very focused on justice and policing and has sort of advocated for an advanced community control of surveillance technologies legislation sort of across the United States. And I think one of the things that I think none of us will argue that we should be on the lookout for overreach of policing power through surveillance technologies. And I think I reflect on a conversation I had with him. His name's Brian Hofer. He runs a nonprofit called Secure Justice, where he is also the privacy commission, head of the privacy commission for the city of Oakland. And what he's recognized is that actually in transportation technologies, the degree of surveillance dwarfs what exists and has been deployed in policing technology. So I think this is where, I think that there are few residents that are going to say, we should not improve traffic. We should not improve ways for us to get around our city. And so I think the imperative for our society as a whole is thinking about how do we systematize communication and start thinking about creating legibility for what are essentially invisible rule sets that govern our communities and our shared spaces. Like, we do not have a common language for even just coming to ground and talking about what these technologies are doing, who's accountable, who has access, who decides. Everything that gets sort of makes your skin crawl and sort of rolls up into, I'm worried about my privacy, is actually I no longer understand who is going to be making decisions and who has the power in this system. So just sort of wanted to just really boost that. Sorry.
One thing I want to quickly interject, just real fast, I'm sorry, François, is that Jackie's point is that, in fact, there are many documented cases of communities that do not want to improve their transportation because they see poor transportation access and poor services as a moat against gentrification. Yeah. So having watched that perverse conflict play out of like, no, don't use technology or anything to improve my neighborhood because then white people will drive me out is a real perverse consequence of our actions.
The flip is true, too, that the elite neighborhoods don't want any services to go in because they're happy to travel in their cars. So if you start bringing in public transportation, the wrong kind of people might come.
So I think there's like a connecting of issues that I think most members of the public don't necessarily have the ability to understand. So for example, I was working on a project recently where they were describing the introduction of electric vehicle charging technology in a marginalized neighborhood. And even though the electrification of vehicles will, over the long term, improve air quality in this neighborhood, and this neighborhood cared deeply about public health outcomes. They saw the EV charger as a symbol of gentrification, and they fought it. And it was largely because it was like, oh, electrification is awesome. There wasn't a broader connection to the overarching policy objective of the why of electrification, because they couldn't see themselves as a user of an EV, and so they see the creation of that infrastructure as
being for someone else,
and not for them. But when we think about like, well, why do we want to electrify? Because we care about air quality, because we care about climate change. Then we start shifting that dialogue, but then the impetus becomes on the public sector to be able to connect back to exactly how these shifts in systems can achieve those outcomes in the longer term.
François?
C'est un élément important sur la question de raconter une histoire. Il faut que ça fasse du sens pour les gens qui ont à l'utiliser. Et je ferai un lien avec justement le pouvoir des entreprises privées qui, elles, ont la capacité aujourd'hui de prendre ces données et les transformer en utilisation concrète qui, dans le quotidien des gens, font du sens. Il y a les villes et les gouvernements jouent à armes inégales complètement avec les entreprises privées parce qu'elles n'ont pas cette capacité de développer, de planifier. Souvent parce qu'ils ne savent même pas quoi faire avec l'ensemble des données qu'elles possèdent. Récemment, on a fait une grande étude franco-québécoise auprès des municipalités françaises et québécoises pour connaître leur utilisation des données, leur perception, comment ils utilisaient les données. Et on a fait la même chose auprès des citoyens français et québécois. Et ce qui est ressorti est assez fascinant. On se rend compte que, juste sur la question climatique, par exemple, que autant les villes que les citoyens ne voient pas énormément d'utilité d'utiliser les données pour des questions climatiques ou des technologies qui pourraient nous aider à faire face à la crise climatique, alors qu'au contraire, les villes sont assis sur des immenses ensembles de données qui pourraient aider à développer des technologies. Et c'est là que je parle d'armes inégales et de créer du sens. C'est que du moment où les villes et les citoyens ne voient pas l'utilité ou comment on pourrait développer des usages pertinents dans leur quotidien. Par exemple, on parlait de l'électrification, mais on peut parler de gestion des eaux pluviales, par exemple, ou de lutte aux îlots de chaleur. Comment planifier l'urbain? Comment intégrer, par exemple, l'utilisation des jumeaux numériques à partir des ensembles de données et mieux planifier la revitalisation de nos infrastructures en intégrant des impératifs climatiques. Tout ça est potentiellement possible de le faire dans nos villes. Encore faut-il que les gestionnaires y voient une utilité, sachent quoi faire avec et puissent utiliser ces données. Et donc, cette question de pouvoir que tu mentionnais, de voir comment on peut transformer cette capacité, ce potentiel de capacité d'améliorer les services urbains, ben, il faut être capable de le rendre sensible ou de créer une histoire ou du sens dans l'esprit des gens pour que ce transfert se fasse et qu'on puisse avancer. Sans ça, ben, c'est pas concret. Il y a pas d'impact à notre quotidien. Et quand il n'y a pas d'impact à notre quotidien, ben, on voit pas pourquoi on l'utiliserait.
So this is interesting. Let me ask you sort of a three-part question then. Do governments need to build technical capacity? Do they need to build, let's say, regulatory or analytical capacity to understand the impacts of new tech? And do they need to work better on how to communicate these things? I mean, it sounds as though what we're saying is the government needs to be better at all three of these, sort of related and difficult tasks. How would you prioritize those? How would a government go about building such capacity?
Yes, yes, and yes.
Okay.
I think the key thing, and François had mentioned it a bit, digital twins, right? What's happening is there's available data, and government then said, well, we need that data because it'll help us understand things. One of the pieces of our work I did in Seattle Department of Transportation was we came up with a draft. It'll remain draft forever because the mayor wasn't interested in anything about it, but a transportation infrastructure plan, which was basically how do we use information, so how do we program it? And part of the key understanding is what information do you need to do what particular thing.
Okay.
So for instance, in that conversation about MDS, we need real-time data, so therefore you need to give it to us. We were looking at the uses within the agency, and no one actually had needed real-time, up-to-the-minute data on the movements of these shared vehicles.
So they thought they did, but they didn't really understand why or couldn't give a reason.
You didn't actually have a use case for it. What the use case you had was for maybe 6 months of data so you can do better planning. And so part of the reason was, well, we need to know where they're going, so therefore we'll program where a bike lane needs to go. Do you need the actual OD route data, or can you put sensors on the road? And so therefore do bike counts and scooter counts, which will be less invasive, right? But because there was available data, then we need that. Understand also that there was a power dynamic. There were things that the private companies, mobility companies, understood about the system that the government did not. And you needed to balance that out.
Such as?
But from the such as where are people going and where is demand? And how equal or unequal is this? And of course, there's a track record of TNCs kind of skirting around, giving the wrong information to government, right? And which affected permitting and everything. But you need to be very clear first about the values, I'll repeat that, and then the use cases, therefore get the appropriate technology. Again, the head of the TOC, when I was leaving, said, hey, Benji, what kind of sensors should we get? The new generation sensors we should get. And I was like, well, what questions do you need to answer? Then we go into what technology you need.
I'll push back on that for just a second, though. What's interesting about your very rationalist take on that is that many of the big companies, Uber and others, are collecting that granular data and then employing teams of data scientists to ask questions after the fact.
Right.
I mean, that's the big data AI revolution there in a way, is you do complete data collection and then later questions emerge that you might want to query that data set. So I've always understood that government impulse of like, we might need this later, but you don't know until those capabilities evolve.
Well,
So-
I'm totally with there, but that's aggregating data and then analyzing it. That's
Yeah.
different from
That's-
real time.
Yes.
I need to know it now,
Yes.
right? What's going on?
But they have it, so do we.
Well, but I think it reflects a scarcity mindset in government where it's, I've run many data collection campaigns in New York City, one of which was actually working with the public to map the entire urban forest in New York City. Still a project I'm super proud of. But I still remember going up to some of the leadership in my agency that was like, well, while the public is out there and we're doing this comprehensive mapping effort, let's collect 50 things. And I was like, okay, hang on. Why do we actually need to know those 50 things? How will we maintain the data that is collected here? What decisions will we want? We ultimately narrowed that down to 20, partly because we also needed to make sure that the members of the public had a great sort of data collection and sort of like contribution experience. But also it just did really require that deep interrogation about like, no, why? What is the existing business process that this piece of information is going to plug into?
Right.
And I think that's where the capacity that ought to be created, I think, and this sort of relates to sort of my philosophy of data and analytics in government, is thinking about lifting the analytical capacities of the people that are already there, the operational staff, the analyst staff, the policy staff, because they actually understand the system intimately. They already know where there could be the potential for better information, but they don't have the skills to be able to leverage that data, to be able to analyze that data and to apply it day to day. So I think that's like one place to start, because when you start getting disciplined about asking questions, then you can also have conversations like, what's the most minimally invasive way that we can collect this information?
Et c'est intéressant, cet élément-là, de travailler sur des projets qui nous permettent de réaliser et de prouver l'utilité de ces données et de voir comment on peut transférer un ensemble de données en amélioration de processus, en amélioration des services aux citoyens. Je pense que c'est un élément qui est fondamental parce que lorsqu'on parle de comprendre à quoi ça peut servir dans notre quotidien pour les employés, c'est vraiment évident. Et je prends l'exemple, lorsque j'étais à la Ville de Montréal, on voulait intégrer justement l'utilisation de l'intelligence artificielle dans les processus des travaux publics, donc que ce soit pour le colmatage des nids de poules, le déneigement, etc. Donc, ça peut paraître une science-fiction, mais ça peut être concrètement très, très intéressant de mieux planifier l'ordonnancement des travaux. Mais il fallait débuter par quelque part, tu sais. Et donc, l'idée, ça a été d'intégrer sur l'ensemble du matériel roulant qu'utilise l'école bleue, que ce soit pour le déneigement ou encore des GPS. Mais pour y arriver, pour collecter cette donnée-là, il fallait négocier avec l'ensemble des syndicats pour être capable d'intégrer ces capteurs de données pour pas que ça soit perçu comme de l'espionnage auprès des employés. Donc déjà, en termes de transformation organisationnelle, il y a des éléments qu'il faut passer. C'est simple d'avoir la technologie, mais encore faut-il y arriver. Mais le but était simple, c'est que la première étape, ça a été de le réaliser auprès de l'ensemble du matériel de déneigement de la Ville de Montréal pour capter de la donnée, générer de la donnée massive, pour qu'éventuellement qu'un algorithme, on soit capable de mieux comprendre le quotidien du travailleur sur le terrain et d'adapter l'ensemble des opérations secteur par secteur. Parce que ce qu'il faut comprendre, c'est que une ville comme Montréal, qui est construite de façon tellement différente d'un bout à l'autre de l'île, où les chutes de neige ne sont pas les mêmes d'un bout à l'autre de ville, et même les tempêtes de glace, ce qui fait en sorte que si on lance des opérations identiques sur l'ensemble du territoire, ben on va répondre à aucun besoin particulier. Et donc, en travaillant avec un système d'intelligence artificielle, en captant les données, on va être en mesure éventuellement, dans une ville comme Montréal, d'avoir des opérations qui vont vraiment mieux répondre aux enjeux locaux lors des tempêtes ou du verglas, qui ne seront pas les mêmes. Et là, on va améliorer les services. Et ça, pour les travailleurs, quand on leur explique cette chose-là, ben pour eux, ça fait du sens. Puis là, ils vont venir même contribuer à améliorer la connaissance du développement de l'algorithme. Et puis par la suite, ça va être un moyen de communication beaucoup plus facile auprès de la population pour leur expliquer vers où on s'en va. Et ultimement, c'est toujours gagnant de leur dire, ben peut-être que d'avoir ces technologies-là va nous permettre d'enlever les fameux panneaux de stationnement et on va savoir, grâce à nos téléphones, quand vous avez à déplacer votre véhicule sur la rue, dans un délai plus court que 6 heures ou 8 heures d'avance, peut-être une demi-heure. Et donc, vous voyez, toute l'idée derrière ça, quand je parlais de raconter une histoire, ben, il faut commencer à la base pour le construire. Et lorsqu'on travaille sur un cas spécifiquement comme celui-ci, on donne un exemple à l'ensemble de l'organisation après. Puis là, les autres lèvent la main tout de suite en disant, ben nous aussi, on aimerait participer à un projet comme celui-ci pour être capable de développer notre expertise et notre capacité organisationnelle à améliorer les services aux citoyens.
Can I jump in with a slightly more constructive response and just jumping in on Benji? With my project, one of the questions I get asked all the time is, Greg, why should cities care about augmented reality? Like, what does it mean for them? And my response always to them is, do you remember Pokemon Go? Like, do you remember Pokemon Go? Jackie was at the New York City Parks Department in Pokemon Go, and she had to explain to her reports about why there were people stampeding through Central Park chasing Pikachu. And that's a fun story, but also there was researchers that showed that maybe many as 30,000 people were injured by distracted drivers playing Pokemon Go when they crashed their cars or hit pedestrians. And I think about this with cities. What happens when all of your goals and objectives for Vision Zero or reducing fatalities from driving are thrown out the window in a heartbeat because of invisible Pokemon that are flying around the city? And this matters now because Google, a month ago, unveiled its new geospatial creator. So they have a worldwide visual positioning system owned by Google that combines maps and down-to-the-meter technologies. Apple bidding to create the Vision OS, now trying to bid on reality as well. Mm-hmm. And so my talk to cities is like, how do you understand what's happening here? How do we start negotiating with these companies now to either get access into the VPS so that you see this insane, obscene digital sculpture dropped into the middle of your public square, or can perhaps work on this, and you know what's happening there. And the other case in this, just quickly in this, is I'm trying to get cities together. I have a call tomorrow with the head of the Metaverse Standards Forum, which is an umbrella group trying to write these standards. And the group that I'm part of that's in charge of writing real virtual world integration, their first use case is ride hailing. Like literally, how do we construct the standards that we'll need that we can do ride hailing? There is not a single public official in this group. It's public policy people from Meta and engineers from Intel and NVIDIA, and there's not a single designer. And so they're just making things up. We're back to the stage of tech companies are making things up that will affect the rest of us. And this is my point to cities. You have to figure out how to intervene now. You have to figure out, I know you have a lot of other problems, but what kind of staff resources and commitment can you make to shape these standards, this ounce of prevention, so you don't need a pound of cure later in this one? And I think that's where cities have a role to play. Like shape the standards, partner with the tech companies early if you can before the stakes get high and there's billions to be made. And so we hope to do that before Pokemon kills again.
I'm going to jump on that too. An old mentor of mine, when I was in my 20s, said, and this is standard, right? The people who know how will always have a job. Mm-hmm. The people who know why will be in charge. And I think we need both of those in government, right? We need the people who know how, which was very hard because the tech companies were paying through the roof, right? Now that they're laying off people, maybe it's going to be a little easier to find the right coders and developers who understand this. But also we need the people who understand why, and why particularly in terms of equity, in terms of inclusion, in terms of climate, of why you would do these things. And we need those both. And lastly, we need to free technology from the procurement and business use case model that isn't in government, where it's the IT department that decides what kind of technology.
Right. So you're buying a database, but instead of buying a database, you should be figuring out what problem needs to be solved and then some technology to address that. So this is interesting. So from François, what François was saying, we've got government needing to understand how to use tech and how to make a case for it for its own purposes. From Greg, we have, and also from Greg and also from Jackie, we have the idea that private private collection and use of data needs to be understood and regulated. I wonder what data is missing. I write a lot about buildings and I write a lot about housing and housing politics. And the obvious one, it seems to me, is that housing markets are not well understood. And that city planning, which plays a very important role in shaping housing markets, doesn't actually understand how they work or how regulation is shaping them. And this is perhaps one of the most important aspects of public policy for cities. We've talked a lot about transportation, where the links to tech and to data are perhaps more clear. In housing or perhaps in other fields, what are some of the big public policy questions that are not currently being captured by data or would be difficult to be understood through a data or numeric lens?
In transportation, it's equity outcomes, right? So particularly in shared mobility, what we've done is some process equity where you say, oh, now we'll consult with the communities. And largely distributional equity, make sure that those bikes, the shared bikes and scooters, or the ride hail serves these particular communities of concern, right? But we don't have outcome measures of how do we know it's actually improving the access and opportunity and social life of particularly of marginalized groups, right?
Social outcomes.
Exactly. And so figuring that out, and some of it can be counted and numericalized, some of it can be at least formalized and institutionalized, and in terms of interrogating whatever project, that is clearly needed.
Else?
I'm not sure that the data doesn't exist, because I think there are, for an issue like housing, because there's so many different interests. What I think is that there's a lack of a framework and a capacity to access data from across all of the different holders of the data.
Right.
To get it to work together and to be able to then be able to actually look at measures. Because I think something like housing this is not, my sort of core competency, but I think of like the data that, real estate agents hold. And I think of sort of like demographic data and sort of income data. And these are all data sets that are held by different institutions that collect them for different purposes.
And which in the United States are much more easily publicly available than they are
Than
here.
they are in Canada. Yeah, exactly. And so I think that I don't think it's a sort of lack of data. I think it's a lack of will and skill to be able to utilize the data towards those objectives.
J'irais même aussi sur la question de... Il y a peut-être certaines données qui n'existent pas. La question est souvent comment la capter et comment aller la chercher. Mais la donnée, elle existe partout, dans les villes, même dans les gouvernements. Un des éléments qui manque fondamentalement, c'est de prendre ces données qui existent, qui sont brutes, et de les transformer en informations pertinentes à de la prise de décision. Et c'est ça qui manque souvent, c'est des outils de visualisation, d'aide à la décision qui n'existent pas. Et même, c'est de comprendre le potentiel de croisement de certaines données. Je vous donne un exemple hyper simple. Vous avez une ville comme Montréal qui a des capteurs partout sur ses conduites d'aqueduc et d'égouts, qui connaissent parfaitement l'état du réseau. Ils sont même capables de prévoir l'impact des averses sur les déversements et sur le réseau. Vous avez une donnée extraordinaire sur les îlots de chaleur urbains. Puis vous avez aussi maintenant les balais de rue à Montréal qui captent les données pour l'état de rue, de la chaussée et des trottoirs. Mais ces trois données-là, hyper utiles lorsque vous avez des travaux à faire, c'est-à-dire que tant qu'à refaire les égouts, les aqueducs, aussi bien en profiter pour réduire les lots de chaleur qu'on crée en surface, mieux gérer les eaux de pluie en envoyant davantage l'eau dans le sol, vous augmentez votre capacité d'adaptation et de réduction des îlots de chaleur. Mais vous savez quoi? Ces données-là, ils sont gérés chacun dans des départements différents. Les gens ne prennent pas le temps, ils n'ont pas le temps de s'asseoir pour voir la pertinence de croiser et les systèmes n'existent pas. Alors, les capacités sont là, les données existent, mais encore faut-il que les administrations aient elles-mêmes la capacité d'avoir le temps de se pencher à réfléchir sur ces choses-là. Elles n'ont pas le temps. Il faut comprendre comment une administration publique fonctionne au municipal pour voir la difficulté, la complexité qu'on a à faire face à tous les ensembles de vérification, le vérificateur général, le contrôleur, les lois, les encadrements, pour comprendre qu'elles n'ont pas le temps de réfléchir à ces enjeux-là. Et c'est ça l'enjeu principal.
I think that's a fantastic insight, I think. And it's also useful that you mentioned that streets and the heat island effect, let's say. I think it's a perfect example of the kind of question that's not asked. People who run city transportation departments don't ask, why are my streets 12 meters wide? Why are we building them 12 meters wide and not 10.5 meters wide? Why can't we fill in that extra space, which would amount to huge areas with planted material and plant trees in it and reduce the heat island effect and increase stormwater retention. These sorts of existing ways of doing things and existing best practices are perhaps not being questioned. And it's perhaps only when you combine the inquiries or the requirements of different departments that you start to ask different questions and to come up with different answers. So perhaps that's a good way to leave things, that looking while collecting data is important of all sorts, we need to begin with asking the right questions and understanding what needs exist that need to be solved, right? And what questions need to be answered.
So are we going to talk about AI now, Alex?
We are out of time, but I think that's actually a great place to wind up. And with AI, perhaps the same things apply. If it's useful, it will be useful in places where governments have decided that it will be useful and have found tasks for it to solve. Do we agree on that? Head nods?
As long as it doesn't hallucinate.
Excellent. Okay. Well, everyone, please join me in thanking the panelists. And Ale, I'll hand it back to you.